Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Pediatric Burnout. All right, today's speaker is Dr. DiFeliceantonio. Yes. He's an operative neuroscientist who studies how the brain integrates peripheral signals to guide food selections and eating behaviors in humans. Her lab at Virginia Tech studies both the characteristics of food themselves and the individual differences of people that confers a risk or benefit for health outcomes. Her work is highly interdisciplinary, bringing together nutrition, psychology, physiology, physics, and neuroscience. Since joining Virginia Tech as an assistant professor, she has been active in seeking funding. She has over $5 million in grants from NIH, of which she is the principal investigator or multi-principal investigator. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alex DiFeliceantonio. Most people see the D and then they panic. And then they're talking about me.
Thank you so much for inviting me today and for letting me reschedule. I actually had back surgery in June. I herniated 2 discs. Do not recommend. Extremely painful. But Carilion Clinic took care of me and fixed me up. So thanks, guys. So I wanted to talk to you today about some of the work that we're doing in the lab. I was kind of debating of whether I wanted to do kind of like a survey of a lot of the different studies that we do or kind of deep dive on one, and I chose the latter because we just finished a trial that I think will be of interest to this group. So I'll be telling you about what we found on the influence of ultra-processed foods and reward processing and energy intake. I'm going to try to use this guy to click, I think, and then I'll use this guy for those of you online who can hopefully see the laser pointer. Just for disclosures, my lab does not receive any funding from pharmaceutical or food companies. Our funding sources are federal, the NSF, NIH, mainly NICHD and NDK, and then we do have some philanthropic funding from the Dome and Company Foundation, as well as Bloomberg Philanthropies for some of our work on the addictive properties of ultra-processed foods. But I'm here to talk to you today about food choice. And so I don't think I have to convince anyone in this room, based on your own experience and probably in your clinical practice, understand that we start making food choices at a very early age. This is my son, Isaac, who also woke me up like 5 times last night, so sorry. I'm a little tired right now, but I feel like y'all will get that. And this is his first interaction with a Jell-O pudding cup. So thank you to my cousin for bringing that into my house. And you can see right here his abandoned apple, right? You know, choices were made. And I think we know that we start making these choices at a very young age and that these nutrition choices accumulate. Oops, I did the wrong thing. All right, I'll get the hang of hitting all the buttons in a moment. And so I don't really think I need to kind of convince everyone that diet affects our health, our bodies, and our brains. So rather than kind of trying to put up, like every single study convincing you that nutrition affects health, I really just wanted to talk about what we really grapple with in my lab, which is the problem of food choice, right? So why do we eat what we eat? Why do we choose what we choose? And so humans are omnivores, right? And that's a word I really love. We're all eaters, right? We can't eat everything. And so therefore, the selection of what to eat becomes a really important one. And a really kind of beautifully complex one, right? And so by one estimate, there are about 75,000 edible angiosperms on the planet, so flowering plants. 7,000 of which are readily and normally consumed by humans. And that's just plants, right? And so we also, sadly, there is no donut tree. We also harvest, we refine, we create new foods. And so, when I think about my job of kind of thinking about how do we understand how nutrition affects health, it can be frustrating. Why don't we know more? Why don't we have more answers? And then I kind of have to remind myself that our input variable is only the biodiversity of the planet, combined with the human ingenuity that brought you the Cool Ranch Dorito. So it's infinite, right? And so in thinking about these foods that we create and these foods that are new in our environment, We know there was a recent estimate by the CDC that ultra-processed foods, foods that we create, comprise 50% of calories consumed in the US. And also, I think what people might be less salient, well, maybe is salient when you go in the grocery store, but they do comprise 70% of the US market. So of what you are offered to purchase is 70% ultra-processed foods. And when I'm saying the phrase ultra-processed here, what I'm using is this NOVA scale. And this is where, in this kind of creation of these foods, honestly, the food industry has gotten ahead of us, right? They've created these foods. They've taken over 70% of the market share. This occurred mainly in the 80s, when tobacco companies actually divested of their nicotine holdings and purchased at least two major American food producers. And that's when you start to see this large increase in ultra-processed foods. And so nutrition science for a long time has been focused on what is in food and not how the food is made. And the NOVA scale focuses a little bit more on what is in food and a little bit on how the food is made. And so I wanted to go over the NOVA score here because I feel like people hear the phrase ultra-processed and it kind of makes sense and maybe like has a definition, but for the most part, when we're using it, there is an empirical definition of ultra-processed foods, and it's defined in the NOVA scale. And so NOVA was created by Carlos Monteiro in Brazil. I think it's important to understand where it came from, to understand kind of how to use it and why some of the things in it are maybe a little idiosyncratic, maybe don't make the most sense. And so it was created in Brazil by Carlos Monteiro. And essentially, this shift to a market takeover of ultra-processed foods occurred later in Brazil than it did in the US, and he observed it. And he noticed that there were these new foods. So NOVA is new in Portuguese, it doesn't stand for anything. And noticed that there were these new foods from multinational food corporations that were essentially displacing traditional Brazilian culinary practices and traditional Brazilian foodways. And he wanted a way, like any good scientist, to categorize that so that it could be studied. And so he created the NOVA scale. And there are 4 levels in the NOVA scale. One is unprocessed foods. This one seems like, these are things like basically raw ingredients, raw nuts, raw fruits and vegetables, raw meats. Not a lot of us eat a lot of NOVA 1s, right? It also comprises some dairy. The NOVA 2 are processed culinary ingredients, and these things can have a pretty high level of processing. So vegetable oil is a NOVA 2, olive oil, salt, sugar. These things have been pretty heavily refined, but they are available to you as a home cook. And this is where it's important to kind of think about where NOVA came from out of this idea of replacing cooking with prepared foods. NOVA 3s are processed foods. And processed here, what we're talking about is essentially combinations of 1s and 2s. So if you take a combination of 1s and 2s and you bake bread, you've made a NOVA 3. If your local bakery does that, you've made a NOVA 3. If you take some vegetables and freeze them, even if you buy them from the grocery store, that's probably a NOVA 3 if they have some salt added. A lot of cheeses are NOVA 3s. A lot of us, if we're thinking about a lot of the foods we eat day to day, probably are NOVA 3s. They're not 1s and 2s. And what I think, and I mean, it is kind of the fault of the scale that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, but people think of the scales as being linear, like 1s are good and 2s are maybe a little worse and 3s are bad, but that's not really how it was created. It was created to put 1s, 2s, and 3s in contrast to 4s. So NOVA 4s are your ultra-processed foods. These are foods that are industrially produced, and so now we're interested in how they were made. They have to be produced industrially. You cannot go into your kitchen and make a NOVA 4 from ingredients in your kitchen. You can reheat a NOVA 4, and right? You can take that frozen pizza and reheat it, right? But you can't make one, and so that's important. And they also, in the definition of a NOVA 4, we have generally chemicals that are unavailable to the home cook or additives that are unavailable to the home cook. And what's in NOVA is those additives actually have to have a purpose of either extending the shelf life or changing the texture or flavor of a food. And so there actually is a carve out in NOVA for fortification, for example. So a cereal that has just kind of all NOVA 3 ingredients and production methods that has vitamin D or is iron fortified would not then be considered a NOVA 4 just by that vitamin addition. So there is a carve out for fortification. And so this is what we're really thinking about when we're talking about, okay, ultra-processed foods. These are foods that are industrially produced. They contain additives that are intended to change the kind of taste or flavor or texture of the food. And these are what we set in contrast to minimally processed foods. And so this is where we, as people in nutrition science, really started thinking, okay, we've been focused on understanding what is happening with nutrients, right? So what is happening with kind of the makeup of the foods. But we haven't made this distinction very often in our studies. How the food is made, how is it produced? And so it's therefore possible that even if you hold nutrition constant, right? If you have the nutrition exactly the same, the means by which it's produced will produce effects that, we don't understand or that are unanticipated. And I should have said, sorry, I started a little fast. But if you have questions or if you're like, man, you just explained Nova and I don't understand it, please, now's the time. Please interrupt me while I'm talking and I'm happy to answer questions. And so this is what Kevin Hall did, is essentially ask this question. If we hold nutrition constant and we allow processing to vary, can we observe differences? And this was published in 2019. This was a trial run while he was at NIDDK. If you're in the food world at all, this was a big old shakeup. This study was a big deal. And this study, I think, kind of points to or at least the genesis of people talking about ultra-processed foods in the popular culture, probably. And so what did he do in that study? I know probably some of you probably are familiar with it, but I'm going to walk through it. What he did was he brought people in to their metabolic ward, and he ran something that you can really only do intramurally at NIH, which is to keep people in the metabolic ward for 4 weeks, which is so expensive. But this was a randomized control trial. It was a crossover design, and so for 2 weeks, every single thing that they ate was made for them in the metabolic kitchens. And those either were ultra-processed foods, or they were here minimally processed, or he uses the phrase unprocessed here, diets. And what's important is that kind of 2 key things about this trial is that this trial is what's considered ad libitum. And so this is a giant tray of food, right? This is more than each person is expected to eat at each meal. So at every single meal, you're offered more than you would eat. And then you're allowed to eat whatever you want. So even though the trays that are being offered are nutritionally selected, the person can choose what they're going to consume off of those trays. And what he found was really striking. And so again, remember, this is a crossover. And so we've got the same people in both of these arms. And if they're consuming nutritionally matched ultra-processed foods, they consume more energy than if they are consuming the minimally processed foods. And then you can see the macronutrient breakdown of that. But the effect, kind of increase in intake, is pretty large, right? And as you might expect, if you're eating a lot more calories every day, you also gain weight. And so over the course of just 2 weeks, these participants gained about 1 kilo, right? So that's a pretty significant weight gain in 2 weeks. And then if you think about this, again, this is a crossover, some people who started on the ultra-processed arm are then kind of starting here, right, because we're redoing the baseline, but then they are then losing weight on the minimally processed or unprocessed arm. So these are the same exact people. And this study was kind of a big shakeup in thinking about our understanding of whether we should be paying, solely attention to macronutrient and micronutrient composition, or whether we should really be thinking about processing. And we know from that randomized control trial, since then there's been a very small one that's been run in Japan, and then there was one that was recently run in the UK that got a lot of media attention. I don't know if people saw that one, where it was an outpatient trial. But essentially from those 3, we have good evidence that consuming ultra-processed foods increases energy intake and weight gain. And in the case of the UK trial, essentially it blunts weight loss. People couldn't lose weight on the ultra-processed diet. But those are only 3 randomized controlled trials, and one of them was 10 people. The one at Kevin Hall's was the largest and kind of most well-controlled. So that's not a lot of good interventional and experimental evidence, right? What we do have is some epidemiological and population level evidence on how these foods affect our health. And so there was an umbrella analysis published in the British Medical Journal last year or a year and a half ago, essentially trying to pool that epidemiological evidence. And this is a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. If you haven't heard of an I hadn't heard of an umbrella analysis before really diving into this paper. And so you do a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. I'm not sure what happens if you do it 3 times, maybe Beetlejuice appears. But the really cool thing about this paper and why I really like it is that it's data from 9 million people. So yes, it is this kind of correlational, non-interventional data, but the N is huge, right? We've got 9 million people. And what they found was that there are kind of health effects really across the body of consuming ultra-processed foods. I think for the most part, I would think, just coming think about, what would be the largest effects? You might see GI effects, or effects that we know are associated with excess energy intake, like metabolic dysfunction. But you see actually pretty good evidence for increases in mental health outcomes, such as anxiety, as well as sleep disorders and depression. You see increases, and maybe ones you might expect more, of cardiovascular disease mortality, as well as increases in kind of poor metabolic health outcomes, such as type 2 diabetes. And these were ones that they found kind of strong evidence for in these 9 million people. And so how do we study this in the lab, though, right? I am an appetitive neuroscientist. I don't do epidemiological research. I take people into the lab and I do things to them, right? And I study their bodies and brains and look at the outcomes. And so we need to bring this kind of back down, at least for me, to study these things on a human scale, right? Not on a population scale. And so recently, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee met to write the new dietary guidelines. And essentially, they concluded that due to the lack in randomized control trials, that there need to be more interventional studies to actually inform recommendations for ultra-processed food intake. I think people, and I even get this sometimes on reviewer comments, are like, oh, well, dietary guidelines already address ultra-processed foods. They do not. They address processed meats. Dietary guidelines from the American Heart Association address ultra-processed food consumption, but currently they are not mentioned in the US dietary guidelines. And the conclusion of this report is that we need more data. And so what I've been doing in my lab is trying to do some of that work, is to really get at this question, is that if we hold nutrition constant, does the means by which these foods are produced have effects on physiology and brain? And so what I'm going to do is maybe a bad idea, but we're going to try it together. Is I'm going to go through one of our acute studies a little quickly to give you some evidence about how these foods affect the body acutely. And then I'm going to spend a little more time on a study that I think will be of more interest to this group, more kind of a deep dive into a randomized control trial that we just completed. And so first, if we look at the acute effects. And so for me, these two really tie together, and I didn't want to pull one of them out, because if we know we're observing these long-term effects, right? Like we see that in Kevin Hall's study, we see that in our population level studies. If we are to ever get at a mechanistic answer, we should also be able to see acute effects of these foods, right? So when you consume them, there should be something measurable, either in the body or in the brain, that we can then identify to help us identify a mechanism as to how these foods might be detrimental to our health. And so we're going to do that acute one first. And so to do that, we really, maybe obsessively, took the nutritional matching to heart. And we wanted to feed people 2 meals. We called them like snack meals. It's 300 calories of foods that only differed on processing and that were really well matched on nutrition, and then observe what happens to their physiology. And so to do that, we have 2 meals. We have our minimally processed meal and our ultra-processed meal. You'll see MPF and UPF a lot. And these are, you might notice that these are kind of a mixture of ingredients. The reason that they are a mixture of ingredients is, again, we wanted to get to this less than 1% difference in nutritional composition. So these 2 meals, even though they look very different, and the ultra-processed meal is comprised of Nova-4s, and the minimally processed meal is comprised of 1s, and the cheese is a Nova-3. We were able to match almost exactly on total carbohydrate, total fat, and total protein. And then as you can see, this meal is predominantly a carbohydrate meal. We also did that a little bit on purpose. So we really wanted to match on glycemic index and glycemic load. And so if you were kind of reading a nutrition textbook and saying, all right, what is the outcome of this if someone consumes this? You would expect really every outcome you measure to be identical. And then my husband last night was like, oh, I just noticed a little tiny shot glass of water. Yes, that is only 12 milliliters of water that the participants kind of literally take as a shot. Because ultra-processed foods tend to have less water content in the food matrix. And so we wanted to even hold that constant so that it would mix in the stomach. Again, we were maybe a little obsessive, but we wanted to run this really tightly. And so how did we measure things? We were really lucky. Just down the road at the FBRI, the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute, we have 2 metabolic chambers. If you're unfamiliar with a metabolic chamber, it's essentially a sealed room. And all that sealed room does is attached to analyzers that measure gas really well. And so if you're in a sealed room and I'm pumping med air in and then I'm sampling, any changes in that ratio of CO2 to oxygen should be due to the person that's in that room, right? So I'm pumping in a known quantity, I've got my person generating CO2 and oxygen, because really that's what we're all really good at, is turning the oxygen into CO2 and then sampling it out. And I can do some equations and I can make, and through that, understand something about that person's metabolic rate. So this is where you see measurements of kind of basal metabolic rate if someone's at rest, as well as something that we refer to as TEF, or the thermic effect of food, which is essentially once you eat something, you use some of your body has to kind of do things, right, to digest it, and you use a little bit of what you've just consumed. And we know from a lot of work that that signal, that kind of gut signal, is one that's really important to the brain. So that thermic effect of food signal, kind of figuring out, right, what did we just eat, is a good teaching signal for the brain. And so we brought people into the lab, and this is also a randomized trial within subjects, so every single person gets both conditions just on randomized days. And so they consume, here I'm just going to be showing the indirect calorimetry data, but we also get some blood glucose, and we're just getting ready to analyze insulin. And this study was performed by Zach Hutland in my lab, who's he's a 5th year now, PhD student. He'll be graduating soon. And again, to do this one kind of fast and to cut to the chase is essentially we brought 30 people into the lab, and these lines should be on top of each other. You know, if the back of the nutrition label is true, then these should be the same. But what we see is in all of our metrics, and here I'm just showing carbohydrate oxidation, but in every single thing we measured, energy expenditure, blood glucose, there's a difference between the ultra-processed foods and the minimally processed foods. And in this case, we're looking at carbohydrate oxidation. And so one of the fun things that you can do with an indirect calorimeter is to get at substrate oxidation. And so if you're burning fat or if you're burning carbohydrate, that ratio of oxygen to CO2 that you're exhaling is going to be a little different. And so we can actually are sensitive enough to measure that in our chambers, and we can estimate how much carbohydrate you are actually oxidizing that you are burning as fuel after you consumed that high carbohydrate meal. And the minimally processed food actually has a greater increase in carbohydrate oxidation than the ultra-processed food. And as you can see, the ultra-processed food, and we see this in our blood glucose data too, actually just kind of then stays high, and the minimally processed food starts to come down. You know, I wish that, well, the kind of rate limiting step in that chamber is having to pee, so we can't really measure people too far out. We tried to do one at 4 hours, and it was just my postdoc negotiating with the participants as to whether they really needed to get out to go to the bathroom. And so we don't have measurements past 180 minutes, but it would be really interesting to see if these tails also diverge. And so what this is telling us is that we are able to detect an acute signal, right? These foods are different when you consume them acutely. And then if we put people in the scanner, these same people, and look at their brains and show them pictures of ultra-processed foods, the difference, so kind of in each individual person, how those foods could evoke a different metabolic response correlates with the brain response that is evoked by pictures of these foods. So body and brain are communicating, and they're communicating differently depending on whether you're consuming an ultra-processed or a minimally processed food. That was my speed tour through Zach's dissertation. I wanted to spend a lot of time now, hopefully I've given you some evidence that there's this acute difference, right? But I wanted to spend a lot of time on what happens when you eat these foods every single day, right? Because that's most of us, 50% calories consumed. Those numbers are higher in children and they're higher in adolescents. So those are the group that are consuming the most of these foods day to day. So we wanted to essentially run Kevin Hall's trial again and make some changes and also assess the brain. And so this study that I'm about to show you is a behemoth. It was funded by an R21 from NICHD and only really could be done in collaboration with my colleague in Human Nutrition, Foods and Exercise, Brenda Davey, who does a lot of controlled feeding work. Her graduate student, Maria Rego, who just graduated with her PhD, she's had an MD from Brazil previously. And then my graduate student, Emma Leslie, who's also in her 5th year and will be finishing up soon with this project. I wanted to acknowledge them up front because you'll see, it was a beast to run. All right, so who did we enroll? We enrolled, so 27 people completed the trial. It was a crossover design. We'll get into design a little bit more. And you can see the kind of high-level breakdown. What I wanted to point out here is that we had 3 randomization factors in our trial. So when you're running an RCT, you generally have a list of things you want to make sure when you're running a crossover that you are equally putting people in different groups. And so you create randomization factors beforehand. Our randomization factors were age. We split up this adolescent group, 18 to 21-year-old, and what sometimes gets called in the literature is the emerging adulthood, but we're calling young adults here in 22 to 25. We split up people by male and female, trying to make sure they were randomized, as well as BMI. So we enrolled people up to a BMI of 30, but if your BMI was under 25, then you went into one randomization arm. And this was just trying to ensure that, all the men didn't get the UPF diet first, for example. And this will be important later. So what did we do? We essentially ran, if you're familiar with Kevin Hall's study, and I described it a little bit to you here, we ran that study with kind of 3 key differences. Well, I guess 4 key differences. 1, the study population. Our population is a lot younger, right, 18 to 25. 2, our diets were eucaloric. And so what we did is we brought everyone into the lab, we weighed them, and we calculated how many calories they should eat each day to maintain stable body weight. And that's what we fed them. We didn't give them these big trays of food that they could eat whatever they wanted. They had to eat everything that was in their cooler. They had to eat everything that we gave them. And it was calculated to be the calories they needed to be weight stable. So that's a eucaloric controlled feeding intervention. The 3rd difference is that it was outpatient. We don't have intramural money, so we could not keep these people in a hospital setting, right? And so they were out in the world, but they ate the breakfast meal with us, in front of us, and then we gave them a cooler with their lunch and their dinner for the day. And then the 3rd difference that you can see here is that we also performed imaging before and after. So we took a look at their brains, and we'll talk about those data. And so here are our main intake outcomes. We have an ad libitum buffet meal, so essentially a large tray of breakfast food, so they come in fasted, that they consume, and this is kind of their first access to an ad libitum meal. And then we do a test called Eating in the Absence of Hunger. Eating in the Absence of Hunger is an assessment that's used in children and adolescents and is a very good predictor of later weight gain and later high BMI, as well as later metabolic dysfunction, where essentially you take someone who has just eaten and then you offer them snack foods, a kid, you offer them snack foods, and then you offer them some sort of non-food alternative that's age appropriate. So if you did it in a child, you might give them toys. We had adolescents, so we just gave them the internet and their smartphones, which they'd probably much rather be on anyway. So they are randomized into our trial. You go on the UPF diet for 2 weeks. We do our measurements. We do a 4-week washout. This is another difference. So we're not going immediately into the second arm. We're going to allow them to wash out for 4 weeks and return to their previous diet. And then they go into the second arm. So this would be an example, but everyone is randomized into what arm they do first. What did we feed them? So you can see some examples here on the top. So we tried to keep these meals, these meals were nutritionally matched. We tried to keep them very similar. So for example, for breakfast on your ultra-processed food day, you might have ultra-processed food, bread purchased from the store, American cheese, eggs, Sunny Delight instead of orange juice. You might have, this is Bailey Capra, who designed a lot of these meals, was a student with Brenda Davey. And so here on the minimally processed day, you have homemade bread. He baked all of the bread for the study with apples and eggs. And so for dinner, you have a stir fry with rice, and then here you essentially have the ultra-processed equivalent of a frozen meal that's been reheated. And so this is an example of what they ate. There were different menus for every day, and there were different menus for every week, so people weren't getting tired of the food. So occasionally for the ultra-processed food, they are like, I am done with American cheese. We used a lot of American cheese. And so this is just to convince you that these foods, that these meals, our intervention diets, are matched. And so you can see our targets here, and then this is our planned nutrient targets, the actual menu, and then the absolute difference. So you can see that we are, off of our planned target, we're 18 calories off. So all of these meals, all of these interventions are extremely well matched. We also matched on things, so one of the critiques of Kevin Hall's study was that they added fiber supplements to the drinks, and so the solid food was not matched in fiber. We matched our solid food in dietary fiber as well as soluble fiber. So you can see 14 here, 13 here, 5 here, 4 here. We matched on added sugars, and then also on some micronutrients such as sodium and potassium. We also matched on glycemic index and the healthy eating index. And so this is not like a kind of hugely unhealthy ultra-processed diet, right? We're matched on the healthy eating index. And so these diets are matched, as I said, on the macronutrients and micronutrients. We also had people taste them and rate them on pleasantness and acceptability. And these data, we published a registration of this clinical trial with all of the information on the diets as well as the pre-testing that we did on the diets, if anyone is interested in looking at that. And so the big question, though, I told you that first difference was, well, I guess the first difference was age, but that second difference was that this was an outpatient trial. We didn't have eyes on these people all the time, and they were for the most part college students and graduate students. And so did they eat what we gave them, right? They could just be taking these foods and throwing them out. And so in a subset of participants, we did 24-hour urine collection. And so that allowed us to look at urinary biomarkers such as sodium, potassium, and nitrogen, a marker for protein, and ask, are these values in the urine what's expected if they're consuming the diet that we gave them? Because we know how much sodium, potassium, and protein is in everything that they ate that day, right? And so we should then see that excreted in their urine, with, depending on the urinary biomarker, between like a 10 and 20% loss. And we find that actually they are pretty compliant. We have very high R values. What we measured from their urine lines up very closely to what we would expect from what they're consuming. As well as they have to return each of their kind of empty containers to our research assistants and to the graduate students. And part of running this type of controlled feeding is to have good rapport with your participants. They basically have to look you in the face and lie to you and be like, I dumped this out. And I feel, we did have people come back and say, oh, I only ate half of this. So for the most part, we had about 98% compliance. And even the people who did not participate in the urinary biomarker did actually consume the food. And there were a couple people excluded for non-compliance in the dietary phase. The other thing that gives us confidence that our participants, that we did the eucaloric feeding trial correctly and that our participants are eating what they said they were going to, what they ate, was that their weight stable throughout the intervention. And so their weight stable within less than a kilogram all across the intervention. And so they come in, they get weighed every single day. If they start losing weight, then we have snack modules where we can increase the amount of food that we're giving them. If they're gaining weight, then we essentially take one of those snack modules away. And so they remain very weight stable throughout the study. And this also gives us confidence that they're eating what we gave them, because if they were eating completely outside the diet, especially day to day, we would expect to see some weight fluctuations, and we don't. And also this gets back to the kind of big difference between this study and Kevin Hall's study, is that we're not then dealing with, one of the questions was, okay, so if you eat more and now you're gaining weight and now you're going to eat more because you're gaining weight because your metabolic need is higher. So now we're just changing diet, but we're holding that metabolic need constant. And so our outcomes for the Adler breakfast meal, and so just to kind of tell you what is on that meal, these were also matched for their nutritional characteristics. So here you can see percent fat, protein, carbs, and then this is energy density. And then, what are the items that kind of make up that UPF versus non-UPF breakfast meal? Sunny Delight orange juice, versus 100% juice, a Pop-Tart versus a homemade banana muffin. You kind of get the idea of how we try to match these things, was actually to produce a lot of the things in our kitchen that had a nutritional similarity to UPF foods. We also match these foods on subjective and objective hardness. There has been some debate in the literature as to whether, kind of increased eating rate and increased consumption of UPFs is due to their softness. And so we did match these foods on how hard they are. We went over to the food science department and used the texturometer, which is a really fun machine that like mashes foods, kind of mimics the human bite. And so it tells you how hard a food is, how many chews it would take. And so all of our test meals are matched on hardness. And so to get to some data, finally, sorry, we have, here we're looking at the caloric intake during the buffet meal. And if we look at everybody, it is the flattest of flat lines. It is like the one thing you don't want to see at the end of your randomized control trial, right? Is that you have no effect. I mean, I find this extremely interesting because it means that if you have no effect here, that the ad lib aspect of the diet matters, right? So that having access to those foods at all times is what then leads you to overeating and overconsumption. And what environment do we live in? It's the ad lib environment, right? We don't live in a eucaloric environment. No one's handing you perfectly portioned meals. The bag of chips that's got twice as many chips is like 15 cents more. And that seems to really hold true for our older age group. And then the next thing we did, because this wasn't our CT, is to then test, okay, on all of our randomization factors, are there differences? And so remember those randomization factors were age, sex, and BMI. And we found no differences based on sex and BMI, but we found big differences in age. So our older participants, the young adults, kind of look like our study mean, right? They seem to really have no effect. When they consume the UPF diet, they get this access to this ad lib meal, nothing, right? So it really seems to be that ad lib access seems to matter for them. However, the adolescents, our younger sample, eats more calories in that buffet meal after being on the UPF diet than being on the minimally processed diet. And again, they're weight stable, they're not more hungry, they just consume more in the buffet meal. This was not statistically significant, but trending of what they're eating, and in the buffet meal after consuming the ultra-processed foods, they tend to then choose more ultra-processed foods to consume. So they're eating ultra-processed foods for the diet, and now this is kind of one of the questions of like, oh, then if you're offered options, do you then kind of pick the minimally processed option or the ultra-processed option again? It seems that in the adolescents, they're picking the ultra-processed food more, so they're choosing to eat what they have been eating. And we also see, and so it's not really driven by the NPF. You can see they eat a little more, but barely more of the minimally processed, but there's really not any trend here as far as increasing the calories from the minimally processed foods. That increase in caloric consumption seems to be driven by the ultra-processed foods. They also tend to increase their eating rate. And so this was something that was observed in Kevin Hall's study, that essentially on the ultra-processed diet, people ate food faster. And we know that consuming foods faster leads, because you can start to kind of bypass some satiety mechanisms, can lead to increased energy intake. So again, this wasn't significant, but was kind of starting to trend of an increase in eating rate in the adolescents in our younger sample after the UPF diet. And remember, we've held texture constant. So it's not that in our test meals, the ultra-processed foods are softer and easier to eat. They're equally as hard as the minimally processed foods in the test meal that's being measured here. So this eating rate is being driven by something else other than texture. And so the next thing we did was to look at eating in the absence of hunger. Again, I mentioned, so this basically you have participants wait 30 minutes after an ad lib meal. This is standard eating in the absence of hunger procedure. 30 minutes after an ad lib meal, and then you put them in a room and you give them generally an array of snack foods, and then you tell them, okay, we want to measure how much you like these snack foods. So take 2 bites of each snack food and then tell me how much you like it on a rating scale. We just used a liking scale. If you're doing this in younger children, you might actually have them do it on a paper or kind of point to a scale of how much they like it. And the point of this is just to start that they have to taste each food. Sometimes you use the liking data, sometimes you don't, but it's really there to get them to taste each food. Again, we match these foods on nutritional characteristics as well as hardness. And so these foods are also matched on hardness, objective and subjective hardness. But they're all snack foods, right? Because that's what we do for an eating in the absence of hunger test. We've got cookies and chips. And what we see is, so this is just 30 minutes after. And so what we need to know is, are they eating in the absence of hunger? So it's possible that one group is hungrier than the other after the buffet meal. But actually, our participants seem to be equally hungry, right? So after they've consumed the buffet meal, and again, the buffet meal, they don't have to eat the whole thing. They just eat as much as they want to satiety and tell us, okay, I'm done. And then that starts that 30-minute timer. And before the eat in the absence of hunger test, they tell us, how hungry are you, immediately before. And they're not very hungry, right? That's good, because they just ate. They're not very hungry. And we now know that anything they do is eating in the absence of hunger. And what we find is a similar pattern to what we were seeing in the buffet meal. So even though those younger participants, those adolescents, just ate more in the buffet meal, they're not any less hungry, and they eat more in our eating in the absence of hunger test after consuming the eucaloric UPF diet rather than the no UPF diet. And in this case, that consumption is being driven actually by calories in the minimally processed foods, not calories from the ultra-processed foods. And you might think like, oh, like maybe that's good. They're eating more minimally processed foods. But I want you to remember what our minimally processed foods are. Our minimally processed food options are kettle potato chips versus Pringles. So they're eating more potato chips. Our two different cookies, a homemade sugar cookie versus a store-bought sugar cookie, and then an apple versus fruit gummies. And so if you look at what are they actually eating more of, it's the kettle potato chips and the sugar cookie. So it's not really like a, yay, healthy choices outcome. They're eating more snack foods. And so just to do a quick summary of our intake measurements, so in our young adult participants, these seem to consume similar amounts of food in both of our tests, regardless of their previous intervention diet. Adolescent participants consume more in the ad-lib buffet meal and in eating in the absence of hunger test after that 81% K-Cal UPF diet intervention. Again, that eucaloric intervention, they didn't gain weight. And then this is kind of a fun thing. I wanted to know, okay, if we sum everything they ate across this like really 2-hour session, so it's only 2 hours that they're in the lab doing these eating tests with us, do they just eat more overall? And we find that they do. They consume more calories overall in the session, as well as in the ultra-processed, as well as in the eating in the absence of hunger test. And for me, what this tells us is that, that potentially, we don't know the answer, but potentially everyone, and probably from our epidemiological data, everyone is susceptible to the ad-lib environment, right? We're all going to eat more in the ad-lib environment. In the eucaloric environment, where you're kind of holding energy constant, just the type of food has an effect in certain populations. And we think one of those populations is younger people, potentially young kids, all the way up through adolescence. And that's what we're really going to start to try to dive into. And so there are potentially risk factors for, choosing more UPFs, for eating more if your diet is ultra processed. And one of those risk factors might be age. Let's see where I am on time. I'm going to go through this part to leave some time for questions. Also, you can interrupt me. But we also really wanted to know what was happening in the brain. So we scanned all of our participants. I have a system in my lab that we call a gustometer. It's really misnamed because it doesn't measure gustation, but it delivers precisely timed liquids to the scanner so that we can actually get people consuming things in the scanner. And in this case, it's an ultra-processed milkshake. And so we wanted to know, what does brain response to an ultra-processed milkshake look like before and after exposure? Because it could look like habituation, right? Like you could have a decrease in responding, or it could look like sensitization, where if you're consuming something, then you also have a greater increase. These are really two common patterns that we see in the brain and two common patterns that we see in response to kind of exposure to other substances. And we wanted to know which one it is. And so our participants go into the scanner. We have our kind of manifold. The tubes aren't hooked up here, but they all go outside the magnetic field, so we can run pumps and we can line it up exactly with our collection of TRs, or our collection of our images in the scanner. And it goes into a straw so people can drink it. In our task design, This is randomized, whether you get a Q that's a square or a Q that's a triangle, but essentially what we're giving you is delivery of a tasteless solution. And we use a tasteless solution because water activates portions of gustatory cortex, and so we use a solution that's similar to the participant's saliva. And then you get a delivery of the milkshake. And the reason we do this is in fMRI, you always have to have what's known as cognitive subtraction. So fMRI is not it's not an objective measure, right? You don't get numbers out that mean anything. You have to compare them to something else. And so to do cognitive subtraction properly, you really want to have something that's almost exactly the same experience for the participant, except for what you're interested in. And in gustation, we want to have something coming into your mouth. We want to have you swallowing. We want to have all the motor aspects of swallowing, but with none of the taste and with none of the thing we care about, which in this case is the ultra-processed milkshake. So all the data that I'm going to show you are the tasteless subtracted from the milkshake. So we've already done that subtraction. And it lets us look at both. I'm going to be focusing on the delivery today. And so just to remind you, what we want is a time by diet interaction. We have our UPF diet. They go into the scanner. We've already subtracted out our tasteless, so we're really looking at the effect of milkshake. And now we have 2 time points. And so if we're going to find anything in the brain, we need to have a time by diet interaction, right? So the brain needs to change differently pre to post in each of our diet conditions. And I'm not going to bury the lead like I did in the other one, but what we really need to have is the time by diet by age interaction, right? Because we know that our behavioral effects are only in our younger cohort. So we need to be able to see a 3-way interaction to say anything about what is happening in the brains of these younger participants. I should have taken the animations off this one, sorry. And what we find is that orbital frontal cortex activity. So here, this is this chunk of orbital frontal cortex really borders the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. It's right on the edge. Decreases in response to milkshake in the adolescents after the UPF diet. So here are the extracted parameter estimates. So you go in and you extract the value for receiving milkshake in this area of the brain for every single person. For the pre and post, and you have our UPF versus our non-UPF. And in the adolescent group, I don't know why that is so blurry, but you can see this really classical interaction shape, right? Whereby after the UPF diet, activity goes down, and after the non-UPF diet, it actually seems rescuable, right? It goes back up, even when it starts pretty low. And for almost every participant, it goes up, and here, almost every participant, it goes down. And then over in our young adults, it looks like hot spaghetti, right? It's just a mess. And then the diet intervention does not seem to affect orbital frontal cortex activity to the ultra-processed milkshake. And so you might be, and this also, if you try to analyze these another way and interrogate, is it really like a group effect, or is there some sort of linear risk that is occurring with age? We see this in both our brain data as well as in the intake data. There is a significant correlation with age. So it's not that there's kind of a break. I feel like all of you know that there's like no magical break that happens at any age that a kid suddenly becomes a different person, right? It's always a gradation, and so we have this linear association as well. And you might be wondering, well, like, why the hell is she talking about the orbital frontal cortex? The orbital frontal cortex is a subsection of the prefrontal cortex, which some of you might be aware. I like the orbital frontal cortex because it is actually secondary gustatory cortex. So if all of your senses, right, have a primary area of cortex. Primary gustatory cortex is the insula. Secondary gustatory cortex is the orbital frontal cortex. And so this is the area where essentially you try to combine taste and flavor, right? Because when we eat things, you're actually doing multisensory integration, and you're combining olfaction and taste and making a judgment about it. And so ventral medial prefrontal cortex, orbital frontal cortex also tends to underlie these judgments. And that's what we're doing for taste all the time. So that's why it's a gustatory cortex. And what I think was especially interesting for our cohort is this area of the brain is one that is still undergoing rapid development. So we've got good data that the orbital frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex continue to develop into the 3rd decade of life in humans. There was a nice review by Pascal Rakik, who's about this recently. And this also line up with some previous data. The only kind of trial that can be similar, just because all sugar-sweetened beverages that aren't like pure juices are considered UPFs. And Kyle Berger from UNC ran a sugar-sweetened beverage trial and essentially showed that there was a decrease in ventral medial prefrontal cortex activity after exposure to that sugar-sweetened beverage. And so this is kind of winding up with the previous literature, but we really seem to have an age-specific effect that has not been shown before. So in conclusion, hopefully I've convinced you that ultra-processed foods have different acute effects. They have effects that we kind of wouldn't expect by looking at their nutrient composition. And that overall, even on a eucaloric diet, an ultra-processed food intervention can lead to energy intake, can lead to an increase in energy intake, but only at populations that are potentially at risk, and we think one of those populations is younger people. We are following this up with an R01. We're really interested in this age effect. And so we captured one of your colleagues. I mean, we didn't lock him in a room, but we have David O'Neill, who's out in Rocky Mount, to be a co-I with us on an R01 submission where we plan to recruit 16 to 21-year-olds. I would love to try to do younger people. Getting younger people in the scanner is hard, and it's not something I have some expertise with the kind of adolescent 16 phase, but younger than that, we'd have to. Feasibility gets a little fuzzy. And so we're going to be doing a parallel design and look at how these effects might persist. And so, like I said, we don't do any of this work alone. I'd like to acknowledge my lab. Zach Hutlin and Emma Leslie ran the studies that I showed you from my lab, Maria Rago, and then Emily Schmall did, which I failed to mention on the urine slide, I apologize, did all of the urine analysis for her master's thesis, as well as my colleague, Brendan Davey in Human Nutrition, Foods, and Exercise, and I am happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if there is any kind of study testing, like psychological, any kind of screening for like anxiety disorders or things like that that could influence food choices?
Yeah, so I mean, the area of whether UPFs affect mental health is a big one. I showed you that study. So we don't give any, like the BDI or the BA or anything early on. We ask them to self-endorse. And so we say, you know, like, have you been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or with depression? And that is an exclusion criteria. But for the future study, it's something that we really want to measure and see if, you know, there are correlations in with kind of baseline mental health and see if that will kind of, you know, influence. And kind of thinking about this, the grant that we're submitting right now is really focused on that individual susceptibility, and mental health could be one of those. But in this one, we don't have a good measure, just that they don't, in their medical interview, they say that, you know, I have not been diagnosed with anxiety or depression, or any other psychiatric disorder, I should say, but anxiety and depression being the most common. Yes, in the back.
So in your two matched meals, I mean, your ultra-processed meals didn't really seem that bad.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about peanut butter and jelly and, you know, sort of Lucky Charms, but that's a different food group. But, I mean, Takis, you know.
Yeah.
You know,
So basically,
pizza, I mean.
we kind of handcuffed ourselves, right? And we did that a little bit on purpose. And even my graduate student, those 2 meals that were looking at the physiological response, I was like, Alex, I'm going to do so much work, and it's going to be the same, you know, because they're so nutritionally matched. And in ultra-processed foods, and thinking about increasing intake, they have a lot more levers to pull, right? So you mentioned Takis. They have that flavor, they have intense flavor, they have high sodium, and they also have a textural change, right? So you bite it, and then like a lot of processed fried products, it's crunchy and then it's soft, right? And so those are really good levers to drive energy intake and to drive over intake. And the meals that we used, for the most part, they were matched on Healthy Eating Index. They weren't things that were kind of, if you wanted to make your list of like foods in your mind that might have the most ability to drive excess energy intake, they weren't those. And we're still seeing that increase in energy intake, and we're still seeing those physiological differences.
Yeah. Do you feel like you're fighting sort of a difficult matching thing because you know that ultra-processed foods has additives that increase dopamine release, and those aren't on the package necessarily. Those aren't things that you can match by looking at the.
Yeah, so we use NDSR to match, and so even though package labeling, you know, it has to be, I think, under 0.5 gram, and then you don't have to put it on the package, but it still is in the USDA database. And so we can, and additives are really difficult, right? Because we're essentially relying on food companies to tell us, and we do, you know, some of our own testing. The government, who knows what the government's doing these days, but they did use their own testing and generate these databases. So we use NDSR, at the back end of which is FNDDS, which is essentially, if you're looking at NHANES data, you know that it's maintained by the USDA of analysis of these foods. But additives are really hard to match for. And so in our intervention diets, we tried to match for the number of additives, but we could not match for the type. And we could not match for the type also because the type of additive is part of the definition of a UPF, right? And so if you're adding an extra flavor, that makes it an ultra-processed food versus if you're adding a vitamin, then it doesn't kind of switch over. And so where I kind of, in starting out in this space, like I am also kind of very frustrated by this idea of the kind of standard that we're being held to is nutritional matching or additive matching. But if you look at what's in the environment, we know these foods have higher additives. We know they're higher fat, they're higher sodium, they're lower protein, and they're lower fiber. Like if you take an average of all of them, right? And so the kind of real comparison would be non-nutritionally matched. But I think if we can show that these foods have differences, even nutritionally matched, and then we show again, you know, obviously they have differences when you allow nutrition to be the average of what's available on the market or the average of what's consumed by, you know, a person in the U.S. That's going to be kind of powerful data for understanding how are these foods having the effects that they're having.
It seems like having a third tier or a third arm is going to be like healthy matched Rocky Mountain diet. That's your
Kevin Hall, before he left the NIDDK, had started that study. So essentially having an ultra-processed diet and then an ultra-processed diet that was considered highly palatable. So there's a metric for hyperpalatability that includes added fat, added sugar, and sodium. And then a minimally processed diet and then a minimally processed diet that met some of those hyperpalatable. And so to start to tease apart palatability and basically kind of all the levers that ultra-processed foods have access to get us to eat more of them, as well as trying to have an arm that's nutritionally matched. We haven't done that. We have another set of studies that we need to do in the chamber, and that's one that I've been thinking about of, you know, what if we change palatability? What if we change nutritional composition? Or what if we actually try to do like a one-to-one match on additives? Yeah.
What about, now your studies didn't cover this, but what about things like visual cues and packaging or marketing?
Yeah, there's no, and so the thing that I find really interesting about kind of our study and Kevin Hall's study is that like one of the things that we think that is driving ultra-processed food consumption is its availability. And then also, you know, in the registration paper, we do measure cost. So our diets are actually just buying them from the grocery store. They're the same cost. But then if you then factor in the wage worker that you have to pay to produce those foods, they cost 3 times as much. And so it's thinking about labor. And that study, Kevin Hall's study, and ours, it removes those factors, right? Everything's out of its packaging. Everything in both of ours, you don't have to cook anything. You know, like everything is heat and eat. And when you get the buffet meal, you don't have to cook anything. But we're seeing increases in energy intake there when you've taken away those factors. But we also know that those factors contribute, right? And so advertising, you know, there's no, when you walk into a store, it's not like the new best blueberry or, you know, like new cultivar of apple, right? It's, you know, advertisements for new flavors of ultra-processed foods, and ultra-processed foods get to kind of infinitely iterate. You know, we have the Cool Ranch Dorito, we have Takis, we have so many different flavors of what is essentially processed corn and oil, right? And so I think, you know, again, we're back to this, like, we're not testing, we're like trying to take these things and put them in their most constrained environment where we might not even expect an effect, and we're still seeing an effect. And then we get to add all the layers, all the extra stuff that ultra-processed foods can do, and it's really, you know, no wonder why they're being overconsumed. All right, thank you, everybody.